Thank you, Rashmi. So, good morning, everyone. This is Matt Ross, and we thought it would be good to talk about the state of aviation because we know so many of the members of the chamber are focused on what happens at LAX. A lot of your businesses are very much influenced by it. Lori and I have spent a lot of time, just because this is our business, kind of geeking out on everything that's happening in the industry over the last several months, and so we suggested to Chad this might be a good opportunity to share some information. So what you're looking at is unfortunately what has happened over the last several months. There are about 2,700 aircraft parked in different places around the country. That is a little bit better than where it was before because we've had about 500 airplanes come back into service since things bottomed out in April. But this is what we're all fighting against, having airplanes grounded as opposed to in the air. When I think we're all familiar with kind of what's happened with the pandemic, shows the number of flights and the drop-off that occurred once things started to shut down, first for international travel and then domestically. The industry really had to scramble to get flights out of the air and stop their service because the demand just wasn't there as people decided, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to travel. I don't want to leave my house, as we all started to understand what the pandemic meant. So by about the end of May, you can see we're on a little bit of an uptick. We're about 67% down in the number of flights that are flying every day. This is a picture of the U.S. airspace at 8 o'clock in the morning on March the 7th. This is a picture at the same time of day on April the 7th. And probably the most striking thing here is the lack of traffic heading overseas. And that, I think, is going to be a trend for a while. One of the things that we expect is that international travel is going to be the last to recover. So that's flights. On the passenger side, it has been even more dramatic because we have planes flying at 50% or less capacity. The TSA tracks all this information. As of about a week ago, we were, flying at basically 20% of the passengers that we would typically have for this time of year. So aviation is a huge driver of the economy, both nationally and in our state. And so we want to spend some time talking about the money side of the equation here because it is very important. It means a lot of jobs and a lot of commerce for both, again, our region and the whole state. The airlines are a very cash-intensive business. They were spending about $100 million a day for the big guys before the pandemic hit. And then the bottom fell out, and all of a sudden they had no revenue coming in. In fact, there was negative revenue because people were canceling flights and getting credits or refunds. We have friends in the industry who talked about how the day when their net bookings were positive was a day for celebration, and that didn't start happening until about the end of April. So what they're focused on right now is trying to reduce their cash burn as much as possible. And the objective is to get to net zero by the end of the year. Right now they're in between 25 or $40 million a day, which is still a ton of money when you think about it. But that's really their challenge. And so, how are they going to do that? For an airline, their two biggest cost drivers are labor and fuel. And fuel, quite ironically, has dropped in price, but they really don't have the opportunity to take advantage of that because they're not flying as much. On the labor side, that is going to be their biggest opportunity coming forward. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the CARES grant and CARES Act and what that means to them. But effectively, they have started shedding jobs already. They will shed more in October when the CARES Act money requirements run out. But there have already been thousands of people in the industry who have taken voluntary separation or voluntary temporary leave, things of that nature, to drive the cost that the airlines are spending down. The other half of the equation for them is a little harder to reconcile because some of these costs are fixed. particularly, as we'll talk about at their airports and some of the other contracts they have. And of course, they have the overhead to run the airline. So with costs being where they are, they need cash. And the carriers have been raising cash since this started. And you can see that some of them have raised more than others. And this changes quite often. American just raised $3.5 billion over the weekend. We expect United to add another $5 billion to their coffers in the next week or so. They're actually going to take out a loan against their mileage program, which is kind of an amazing thing if you think about it, that somebody's willing to leverage that. So, but this cash is needed to keep them alive and to survive the crisis. And everybody is probably thinking, okay, some of these carriers are going to go into bankruptcy. There has been an overwhelming rejection of that by most of the CEOs, and that's primarily driven by they've all done that before, and they were able to fix their structure so that they're much better off and able to survive a crisis like this. But they still need cash to get through it all. On the other side of the equation, you have the airports, and they're not in much better shape. So they also have costs that are substantially driven by personnel. And Justin's going to talk about what LAX is doing in that regard. But the other thing that's a huge burden for the airports is we have been in a tremendous building cycle for the last 6, 7, 8 years, and it was projected to continue for probably at least another 10 years. There is a massive mortgage payment that is due every year to pay for all the debt that has been taken out to pay for these projects. There's nothing you can do about that. It's like many of us, when the pandemic hit, was your mortgage company going to tell you, yeah, don't bother, you don't need to pay your mortgage for the next year, or you don't need to pay your rent for the next year? There are billions of dollars that need to be paid to bondholders, and that's going to be a big drain on the revenue that an airport is generating. And that revenue is going to be reduced. So the airport basically gets their money from two sources. The airlines pay the majority of the costs. Those costs are generally fixed because the airlines typically agree to pay for their share of the airport, whether there's 1,000 flights a day or 10 flights a day. But the other significant portion of an airport's revenue comes from concessionaires, rental cars, parking, other non-airline sources. And a lot of those costs are variable because if the passengers aren't there and they're not parking in the garages and they're not renting cars and they're not buying, sandwiches or whatnot before they get on the plane, the money just isn't there. So there's a big issue that the airports are going to have to face as well. They're going to be challenged to make up that revenue. But it's also going to affect the airlines because the airlines ultimately backstop a lot of the debt that's out there in many of the airports. And I should mention that all of these charts that we're showing are for the industry as a whole. Every airport is different. If you looked at this for LAX, it would not look exactly like this. But just to give you an idea of where things happen. So there's going to be this tension between, and it's already there, between the airport operators, the airlines, and the concessionaires and rental car operators for who has to pay for what and where's the money going to come from. So the federal government stepped in March and put the CARES Act out there, which was $2 trillion, a lot of money for a lot of different sectors of the economy. The airlines got about $60 billion. The aviation industry got about $60 billion. A good chunk of it for the airlines and $10 billion for the airports. That's about 3% of the overall CARES Act. So while there's been a lot of press on why are we bailing the airlines out and things of that nature, the majority of this money has gone somewhere else. But that 3% is going to be very, very important. The airports were allocated the money based on a formula developed by the FAA. You can see that LAX is getting quite a chunk of that, although $323 million in the grand scheme of things is going to be helpful, but it's not crazy money for what the airport spends every year. California also did did quite fine. All the airports got some, and even general aviation was able to benefit from this money. The airlines primarily so far have been the beneficiaries of a $25 billion grant to deal with labor. And so this is payroll protection, very similar to what the SBA has done for small businesses. You can see that the big guys, they all got the majority of the money, but it even has gone to local businesses. So there is $108 million of grant money that has been allocated to aviation companies that are based in LA County. The next piece of the CARES Act for the airlines is a $25 billion loan program. We expect the first airline to take one of those loans will be American. They come with all sorts of strings attached, stock warrants and other things that are going to make it a bit challenging for the airlines to deal with it. But quite frankly, if it's a good source of cash for them, they're going to go for it because it's necessary to, again, to pay the bills as they weather the storm through this crisis.
So really, where is this all lending or leading? We struggle, even as a consulting group, we have a lot of interactions with the airlines on a daily basis. And what we've all come to terms with is we really don't know. We're not sure when returning to normal will actually happen, and there are a lot of theories out there. On this slide, there are 3 different popular theories that I'll kind of go through really quickly. Some of you may have heard of them. The U-shaped recovery, which is the one on the far left. This really anticipates the lockdown will stay for several months, as we certainly know it has. Travel being discouraged, and the borders opening slowly. Customer confidence is taking time. Businesses are restricting travel because it's discretionary and they need to save their liquidity. The economic recession lasts for a while, and we're not out of this anywhere between, or we're not out of this scenario until 12 to 18 months at the best case. The L-shaped scenario, which is the middle one, it looks like the U, but the circumstances are quite a bit more dire. There's longer periods of lockdown. The leisure traffic, which is emerging now, is reduced by fear. Businesses, while facing a recessionary time, are still restricting their business travel. But added to that is they're conducting their business differently. They're using the webinar and different ways to bring people together that defers travel, maybe indefinitely, or at least certainly in a large scale. And then the last one here is really the W, which really looks a lot like the U, except it anticipates a resurgence of the COVID virus and another recovery period to follow. So, we're not sure, but here's what we're tracking. And here's what we do know. We have already seen that the industry will likely be smaller. Domestic recovery is happening first. Matt talked about that. The borders, of course, domestically are more open, maybe with the exception of Hawaii and Alaska. But travel international is really restricted to repatriating. And the change really that we see as we compare it to post 9/11 is it's actually the leisure market that's leading the travel demand versus the corporate. And I think that's just people being people. They want to get out, they want to see friends and loved ones. It's been a lot of time since they've done that, and they're willing to get on an airplane, albeit in a much smaller volume. In order for the airlines to survive this, they absolutely have to maintain the liquidity that Mac talked about earlier, but they also have to lower their cost structure to survive. And what we know is that history tells us that the ones that are going to be most successful, in fact, even maybe predatory during this time, is the ones that can keep the liquidity and their cost structure lower to take advantage of the market. And this slide is, the next slide is actually one that I think adds a far greater perspective than the prior one. And this shows the volatility that the airline industry follows after significant events. So on the left-hand side, you see the US passengers in the billions. This is by year, all the way from 1974, way back then, to the present day post-COVID. And early on, you see in the 80s, you have the energy crisis and PATCO. That took about 4 years to recover. And then you have a couple of recessions in here, one in 1990 with the Gulf War and the commercial real estate collapse, and then the other, which is probably something we all remember, the great financial recession in 2007. Those recoveries lasted longer, 8 and 7 years respectively. In between, we had 9/11. The interesting thing about 9/11 is that the event itself, the terrorist event itself, did not take a whole lot of time to recover from a volume perspective. But you might remember that there was a great deal of bankruptcies that occurred following 9/11, and that's because, and Matt talked about it earlier, that following the dot-com bubble, a lot of the airline industry was not financially stable in order to withstand the 9/11 attacks and the reduction in activity. Today, what we're learning and what the airlines have been talking about in the media is that they're coming off some very good years, and they do have cash in the bank. They're adding liquidity to that, and they've learned a lot from the bankruptcies. So as dire as COVID looks, and it certainly does so on this screen, the fact is they are positioning themselves better to recover from this, and they're optimistic about that recovery. But what they have to do first is they absolutely have to focus on health and safety. We'll hear from Justin about that as well. But it's all about restoring the passenger confidence. The airlines right now are actively communicating the need for face masks, and so are many of the airports. On board, what they want you to know, and this is the airline specifically, they've had HEPA filtration systems in the aircraft. They generate hospital-grade air quality, but they've had these HEPA filters for over 10 years. Nobody knows about it. And they're doing the traditional things that you see in most other retail outlets. You've got the plexiglass and the additional cleaning protocols. On board, you probably won't see this, but you may see more ground time associated with the aircraft at the gate because they're using new cleaning techniques. They're using electrostatic cleaning and fogging procedures on board. They're already doing that and have been doing it. On board, what you're going to notice is a reduction in food service, and that's really just limiting the contact to customers. So that's what the airlines are trying to do. But the biggest challenge they are having is really one of consistency, both at airports and between the air carriers themselves. That's where a lot of the work is now focused. There has yet to be a regulatory action by DOT or FAA to really govern the guidelines for the US. But what has been recently issued is ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, similar to our FAA or DOT. And they have recently released guidelines for all phases of the passenger and cargo travel, all the way from gaining access to the terminal through to the aircraft boarding and then departing through baggage. So a lot of airports and airlines are working through those right now. But I was going to say too, the other piece of this is when getting back to the airlines themselves, they're going to be enforcing the wearing of the mask, and there's been a lot of media about that. The other thing you'll see is new boarding procedures. A lot of the airlines are resuming the back to front to limit the contact with people. And they're also reducing load factors and not allowing the middle seat to be occupied for social distancing. So we touched on flight activity itself, and I think there are probably going to be a lot of questions about that. And that's what this slide is really depicting. So we'll take a look now at what's happening with the route changes that the airlines are facing. And we've already seen it, quite frankly. The airlines are retrenching, to their hubs. They're actually eliminating a lot of the strategic flying that has occurred. As I mentioned before, the airlines were doing quite well before COVID. There were a lot of markets that may have been seen as obscure for either within the US or even Asia and emerging markets. A lot of those routes were very strategic, and a nice word for strategic is that it doesn't make money, but it is subsidized by other routes. Well, that strategic flying is actually not occurring anymore. And it's really focusing on the hubs and which routes are the most profitable. So stepping away from the strategic markets and just talking about the hubs. So we know that the flying has been reduced, and we know the strategic markets have been eliminated for the most part. The hub-to-hub flying will occur, but even that will change. You know, if you were flying in a market that had a high frequency, you could probably expect when you went to New York or Chicago, Boston, that you would have anywhere between 8 to 10 choices a day by airline to get there. Well, now, if any of you have looked online to go to some of these major markets, at most, the airlines will be showing 3 to 4 flights a day. And that is even optimistic. 2-3 weeks out, you'll see 3 to 4 flights. But as the closer you get, at least in today's market, to that booking, to that day of departure, you'll actually see the airlines take on what they call operational unscheduled cancellations. And what they're doing is they're trying to put the flight schedule out there to be ready for demand, but if they don't see the demand coming, they're taking close-in cancellations and consolidating that traffic, again, to remain profitable. So you may see 3 to 4 flights a day, 2 to 3 weeks out, and you may see as few as 1 to 2 a week prior. All of these things that we've discussed so far are near-term actions, you know, addressing the response to COVID, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. There's a lot of thought and discussion going around how facilities need to be adapted. We'll hear later about health screening and temperature reading technology that LAWA is piloting. There is a lot of work that the airlines are doing to implement touchless kiosks, self-bag check, self-boarding, all of which technology has been there, but right now it's taking that technology, which is quite frankly in very few airports today, and accelerating it. Yesterday I was actually listening on the way home to an aviation podcast, and they were actually discussing onboard apps, interesting enough, that the passenger would use their phone to make the selections on board for either food and beverage or for their audiovisual, which is kind of interesting, and because people might be adverse to using the screen that's on the backside of the seat. The other technology that is being deployed is different kind of wayfinding that doesn't require people-to-people conversation, queue management, social distancing automation, audible alerts to people if they're too close or clustered in an area. And all of this is going to take time. All of it's going to take money. But with all of that and all of the change that's taking place, this facility stuff will come next. The whole entire way that we plan for facilities will need to be rethought. And it's going to have a significant impact on the way terminal facilities are planned in the future. Before we close, I want to bring you closer to home and briefly discuss what kind of airline flight activity we see here at LA. This is actually a published flight schedule that we pulled together here at AvAirPros. We have actually made it available to the airport and to a number of airport-related firms, and we can also make it available to any of the chamber members. What we've done is we have no crystal ball. We pull the published flight schedules from a public document, the OAG, and what we're doing here is we're contrasting what has happened prior to today with flight schedules and flights and, and seats. And you'll see the drawdown, the significant drawdown in March, and we talked about that earlier, to a low point of 82%. So what that means is for the weeks of May 16 to May 31, the actual flights and seat capacity at Los Angeles year over year was down 82%. Pretty significant. But I don't want to leave you on that. I do want to point out that there is an upward trend here that can't be ignored. And I want to say that hopefully we would be at a 59% activity level at the end of July. I will have to say, though, that's probably not likely to occur. And the point here being is if you take a look at where we are today in June, there is upward momentum, but you see a pretty high spike in July. And this is that forward anticipation that the airlines are doing, hoping that demand will rise as this published schedule rises. And as a result, they'll be able to be better able to address the passenger demand in this leisure market in the summer. But we know that it's not likely going to occur. We'll probably see some kind of drawdown, but the overall trend is positive, and hopefully we'll have that continue through the summer market and into the fall. Candidly, I think we'll have a lot of leisure travel in the holiday periods, again, because that's the traffic that's traveling. I think the biggest concern that airlines are worried about right now is what happens in the first quarter of the calendar year 2021. So we'll see. But upward is where we want to see this trend. Now we'll turn it over to Lawa and I guess the chamber. Hear from our next person.
Thank you, Matt and Lori. That was a great presentation and providing a phenomenal landscape to the aviation industry today and nationally. Also very sobering. To our audience, please start thinking about what questions you may have for Matt and Lori and jot them down. We'll come back and do our Q&A after our next speaker. So now let's go and look a deeper look at what's happening more locally here at LAX. And talking about local, I would like to acknowledge Airport Commissioner Val Velasco, who has joined us today. Thanks, Val, and welcome. Also thanks to Matt Techley and Jeff Thompson, who have joined us from Council Member Mike Bonin's office this morning. So now we are very excited to hear from our recently appointed CEO Designate, Justin Erbacci from Los Angeles World Airports. Justin Erbacci serves as the Chief Executive Officer Designate for Los Angeles World Airports. He has been with LAVA since October 2016. Mr. Erbacci has oversight of LAX and Van Nuys General Aviation Airports. He leads the team responsible for transforming LAX to a world-class airport for the modern traveler and thus returning LAX to its iconic status. His responsibilities involve managing more than $14 billion in programs to revolutionize how guests access the airport, to modernize all of LAX terminals, to innovate and significantly improve operations, retail, food, and beverage, and the overall guest experience, as well as to bring innovation and sustainability to one of the nation's busiest general aviation airports. He and his team work closely with the community and airport stakeholders to fulfill LAVA's vision of gold standard airports delivered. I'll also personally want to thank Justin for his phenomenal leadership during this very challenging time. His very frequent, transparent, and candid communication to the community and to all of us as partners is well appreciated. With that, here's on to you, Justin.
Great. Thanks very much, Ashmi, and thank you for Chamber for letting me have this opportunity to speak to all of you. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all through Zoom. Hope to be able to see you all in person very soon. But in the meantime, we'll have to make do with this communication. That was really a great presentation by Matt and Lori, so thank you for that. I think you gave a really great overview of the industry and where we are. So I don't want to get into and rehash the passenger numbers. I think that Lori gave a great overview there. You know, just to say that we were down 95, 96% at one point in April. And we've been moving slowly up to where we've been about 84, 85% down for the last week or so. So we're optimistic that things are moving in the right direction, but as Lori said, it's going to take a long time for us to get back to anywhere near where we were. Yes, we see definitely that the domestic traffic is increasing much faster. International traffic, with all of the restrictions that still exist in the industry and in different countries, international is going to be much slower in coming back. So, I think that what we wanted to talk about is the fact that when COVID crisis first came to us, we spent a lot of time reacting, and it was an unprecedented situation where everybody was trying to figure out how to deal with this. So we spent a lot of time trying to just react, and the first and foremost thing was trying to do everything we could to keep our employees and our guests and all of our partners at the airport, as safe as possible during this pandemic. Then the other aspect was figuring out operationally how to react, mainly working with CDC and others, and mainly our federal agents to figure out how to respond to this. And then there was the whole financial aspect that we had to deal with from ourselves. How do we start lowering our costs and being prepared to deal with this financially? And then how do we work with our partners, mainly airlines and concessionaires, to allow them to see what we can do to help them, get through this as well and remain viable. So that was a lot of emphasis in the beginning. Now what we've done is we focused our effort on recovery. Now we want to figure out how do we get people coming back to our airport and how do we deal with getting ourselves to be in a position where we can bring people back to the airport. So that is a big focus now. So what I want to do is give you, Lori talked about forecasting, and if you talk to the airlines, the airlines all will say all the forecasting models, everything else they've used in the past years, they basically threw them all in the trash bin because none of them were any good during this crisis. They had to come up with new and innovative types of methods to determine how they were going to recover, how they were going to deal with this crisis. And airports are no different. And we depend obviously on the airlines and their forecasts and the ability for them to bring traffic back. So we did a lot of modeling and took in as much data as possible, talked to as many people as possible in the industry, looked at customer surveys, looked at everything we could to try to figure out how do we prepare ourselves to develop a forecast pursuant to which we can set up a budget that would make sense. Originally, you see two scenarios here. Originally, we had a very optimistic view of how we saw traffic coming back, and it was more type of a V, where we saw that maybe our traffic was going to be down maybe 47% over 2019 levels. But as time went on and we saw how the pandemic progressed and how things didn't recover so quickly and all the risks that were associated with the pandemic, potentially, a W shape, or as we're hopefully not seeing now, but we're concerned about. We adjusted that and we did a much longer recovery, a much more of a U shape, they call it a pretty big U, as you can see in scenario 2. This is the forecast that we used to project what we're going to do from a budget perspective in the upcoming fiscal year, which for us begins next week on July 1st. So as you can see that we're anticipating that next year will be down approximately 65% for the year from what we were in 2019 levels. So that's pretty significant, but we think it's pretty close to being as realistic as we possibly can forecast. What that means is obviously we have a knock-on effect from that is that when we don't have any passengers here, there's a huge amount of revenue that we depend heavily on to fund our operations that also is not coming back. So much of the concession revenue that we see that we get from in-terminal concessions, that we get from parking, that we get from TNCs, that we get from rental cars, all that revenue is based upon passengers. And when we have this many fewer passengers, we get that much less revenue. So we'll talk about that as we move forward. But to deal with this recovery, we set up what we set up a COVID-19 recovery task force that has 7 streams that we've been working on for a little over a month now, and which we're really active on in the present. One of the first streams is getting our employees back to work. So since March 15th, most of our employees who can telecommute have been telecommuting. So we've had about 1,000 or 1,100 of our 3,500 employees telecommuting since then. But obviously we have to operate an airport, so we need a lot of people here at the airport. So we have had a lot of people that were here physically. But at some point we want to bring our employees back, and we're working on that. But one of the streams that I really want to focus on is how we're getting passengers back to the airport. We're trying to do everything we can to make our airports as clean, as healthy, and as safe as possible to allow us to get passengers to feel comfortable, come back to the airport, feel comfortable traveling, so we can start to generate some more interest in travel. So I want to focus more on that one. We've been doing a lot of different activities in this area, and I'll try to touch on a few, but we're working on the cleanliness aspect, we're working on the touchless aspect, and we're working on signage aspect to make sure we're giving passengers the information they need to be able to fly safe. So from a touchless travel standpoint, we have a common use bag drop that we're using to allow people to check in their bags themselves and their bags by themselves. We're doing this in Tibet. We think this is the wave of the future, so we're very happy to be using this technology and testing it now. And we'll also incorporate biometrics into that, so it'll actually be even a completely touchless process as well. We're working with CBP to implement simplified arrival, which is another biometric process where people can come through customs and without having to exchange documents. We already have global entry kiosks being rolled out next week, which are going to be biometric. So you can, usually global entry, you have to stick your fingers on the pad to get your prints, but here you will be able to just use biometrics. And we're doing simple things like programming elevators so that they stop on every floor, hand-free drinking fountains. A big thing that we're going to be launching next week is an enhanced version of our Shop and Dine application that allow you to order food and pay for your food online and your new mobile device, either before you come to the airport or at the airport, and then you just jump in and you just pick it up. So it's a completely touchless process. Visual assistance booths, also from a touchless perspective. And then from a cleanliness standpoint, we've been doing things from the very beginning, deep cleaning all of the areas multiple times a day. We are using UV technology to purify the air. We are also piloting UV restroom cleaning pilots, so we're using white fixtures that are ultraviolet that also kill germs. Using special types of elevator button covers, escalator handrails using UV light. So we're using lots of technologies to help us keep the airport as clean and as hygienic as possible. And then, of course, from the signage perspective, we're putting signs all over the place to help people understand how they can maintain their health and safety while they're at the airport. Some of the things that we're doing here towards that effect, we've for many weeks now required facial coverings. So all passengers that enter the airport terminals here need to have facial coverings at all times. We've deployed hundreds of hand sanitizer stations throughout the airport. I talked about the deep cleaning. We have signs up promoting and enabling people to understand how to keep proper physical distance from one another, both with signs on the floor and in stanchions. So again, we're doing multiple things to make sure that our airports are as clean and hygienic as possible for passengers. That's a really key point. And then one of the things that we're also piloted yesterday is a new type of technology. We want to try to see how we can keep our airport terminals almost like a wellness island, if you will, whereby we're doing everything to make sure that the people and the facilities are clean and healthy. So we wanted to find a way to do this, and really nothing was happening in the industry. So we just kind of jumped ahead here to try to stimulate something happening here in the industry. And we are conducting, as we speak, this thermal imaging pilot at Tom Bradley. Basically what it does is, as people walk into the airport, we have these special cameras that take thermal checks of you and determine what your body temperature is. And if we identify somebody who has an elevated body temperature, we bring them aside, we conduct a secondary screening with them, and determine with a handheld at that point whether or not they actually have an elevated body temperature or any other types of symptoms of COVID-19. Now, during this pilot period, we're not preventing people from traveling. If they are ill, we're basically just telling them, giving them information as provided to us by CDC and LA County Department of Health as to what they recommend if you are ill and trying to fly. But if we bring it to the next stage, certainly we will have to figure out then what do we do with those passengers, because we don't want them to come into the airport. I think we have a clip of this that Stephanie is going to show really quickly. I think it's really interesting for you all to see. Stephanie, you want to show it quickly?
Yep. 1 second.
With passengers now facing the new realities of traveling in the age of COVID-19, airports are looking at new ways to keep customers safe. Now, starting today, another change at Los Angeles International Airport, a first-in-the-nation pilot program to check passenger temperatures. So let's show you how it works. If you're a passenger at LAX, you'll walk right through here under the watchful eye of a thermal camera. And if the system flags you, you'll be brought over here for a secondary screening to make sure that you don't have an elevated temperature. One camera screening passengers walking in, another rotating 360 degrees, scanning the terminal, zeroing in on any passenger with a temperature of 100.4 or higher. Will you prevent anyone from flying?
No, we will not prevent anyone from flying. But it should be noted that some of the international airlines that are operating out of this terminal are also conducting their own temperature check, and they would be able to prevent people from flying.
For now, the screening is optional, but within 2 months, it could be mandatory.
We want to develop this pilot. We want to get the learnings from this pilot. We want to develop a framework of how it could work not only here at LAX, but at any airport in the country. And so we certainly hope that it will drive that standardization.
So again, this program starts today here at LAX. Other airports around the world have been using similar technology, but this is the first time we would see it here at a major U.S. airport. George?
Okay, Giovannitas, thanks very much. Coming up, guys, our play of the day.
So again, we're trying to take the lead in the industry here to drive a standard, get some learnings, force people to make decisions on this, because we believe that it's just working too slow and we need to spurn the industry. Quickly, just to jump on from a financial perspective as well, we're obviously dealing with an unprecedented crisis from a financial perspective. Last week, the Board of Commissioners approved our next year's budget. Just to see, we had you could see that our revenues went from 1.6 billion to 1.3 billion, so 300 million fewer revenues, and that's only because, as Matt mentioned before, a high percentage, about 80% of our revenue is fixed rents or based upon cost recovery from the airlines. But we still believe that that revenue is at risk there due to many other things that could happen in the industry. So, we have to be very diligent in making sure that we're looking into how we get those revenues. And then as a result, we're forced to be reducing our operational costs significantly. So you can see there, it says we have 119 less than 2020, but in reality, because of inflation and cost increases and salary increases that otherwise would happen, we've actually found ways to save over 150 million in operational costs. And we're going to continue to look how we can do that even further. And so that's something from an operational perspective. But there is a gray lining here through all of this. one of the things that we're doing is using this opportunity with a lot fewer people, a lot fewer cars coming into the airport to accelerate a lot of the construction that we're doing. Probably the biggest savings we're getting is the APM. So we've been able to close down Centerway completely within the terminal to allow them to build the station, throughout the day, 24 hours a day, without having them only being able to work a few hours at night. So that should significantly enhance their activities here, so that by the time people do come back, we won't have that congestion. We can have that roadway back up. We're taking advantage of the opportunity to accelerate many other of our capital programs that we have underway. I won't go into all of them, but really that's the silver lining in all of this. So I know that we're running short of time, so I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I'll give it back to Rashmi.
Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate you sharing your insights to what's happening at LAX. We would like to welcome back all our three presenters so we can open it up for question and answer. As a reminder, if you have a question, use the chat function. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. So the first question we have is from Alan Coleman. Matt, I'm going to direct this to you. How will design accommodate seat separation when the number of travelers increase?
Sure, and I think there are a couple of versions to that question. So in the near term, shortly after the pandemic started, all of the major seat manufacturers started sending out information that they have seat blocking products that they can offer to basically, close off seats. Much like if you've ventured out into a restaurant in the LA area, you'll see that a lot of the seating has been closed off. So that's the sort of the quick fix that deals with the current situation when maybe there aren't as many passengers. Going forward, there are ideas already being kicked around in the terminal design community about, do you put panels up in the hold rooms to separate the rows of seats, or do you change the boarding process altogether? And there's a concept that is used in airports overseas, and was part of the new Winnipeg terminal design a couple of years ago, that's call to gate. So you don't actually show up at your hold room until it's time to board. Now, you back that process up, that just means you need some people prior to that. And you may end up with a situation, if we're in a no vaccine environment, where we are actually telling people, okay, you can come to the airport and you can park your car, but because your flight is at 10 a.m., we don't want you walking in the door until 9:30. And then, we've got a plan for you to process through the facility and just get right on the airplane. But there's a lot of work that has to be done, because obviously our facilities, they've been built and have been accommodating significant crowds in all the hold rooms, and it's going to take quite a bit to change it.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the thoughtful answer. Justin, the next question is for you. This question comes from David Bates at Grant Thornton. David is inquiring, how is LAVA balancing current construction for facility improvement with the decline of revenue?
Yeah, great question. Capital projects are paid for differently than our operational budget. So, we're able to, if you will, borrow money to pay for the construction. And a bunch of the construction that's going on now, we are paid for a little bit later, not right now. But still, what we're doing is making sure that we're trying to reduce our capital costs as well. So we've found ways to save over $150 million in our capital program as well through the management aspect of that. But what we've done is we've looked at our overall capital program, and we've stopped a lot of the projects that were not out of the ground yet. So those that were in the planning stages, we basically put a halt on them so that we're not expending any capital money. And we're focusing on those that are already out of the ground, where construction has already begun, like our LAMP project, our airport facility, our terminal project. It would cost way too much money for us to stop them and restart them. We would actually have to spend a lot of money to just put them in a condition where we can leave them for a while. So we thought it was much more cost effective for us to continue with those projects, especially as we need those improvements really, really bad, because they've been a long time in coming, and we've tried taken so long to get to this point. We want to continue with those. So that's how we approached it. Continue with the ones out of the ground, stopping activity for now on those that are in the planning stage.
So Justin, that's a good segue into specifically, could you comment, and this question comes from Ryan Gales at JGM, what effect is COVID having on the plan and schedule for Concourse 0 and Terminal 9? And perhaps Matt can add on to that.
Yes, so from the perspective of the airport, there are two aspects to that. There is the environmental program that we need to put in place in order to develop not only those two terminals, but also the roadway changes and a lot of airfield changes that we need to do. And so we're continuing with the environmental program for that, because we're 75–80% of the way through that, and it just makes a lot more sense for us to do the little bit more that we have there, and we have to wait anyway for that process. So it gives us the opportunity to get that done. We've stopped any activity about actually spending any money on the buildings of T9 or C0 themselves. We're still working with the airlines to put the proper documentation in place, but we're not spending any money on those projects.
I think to add to what Justin just said, I think one of the things that's happened is the airlines across the country have stopped or paused nearly all of the projects they were working on themselves. But as Lori mentioned earlier, we are going to see some carriers that are very aggressive coming out of this. And, we may see that a Southwest or United says, look, I really need that facility because I'm going to want to take advantage of it. And one of the challenges this industry has always faced is we cannot deliver a new gate in 6 months or a year. The process that it takes is, it almost takes a decade when you start back with the environmental process to add gates to an airport. So it's going to be very hard to be, sort of surgical in when we want to put those things in place. So that's going to be a big challenge that both the airlines and LAWA are going to have to wrestle with over the next year or two is, okay, how long are we going to let this sit dormant?
Thank you, Matt and Justin. So Matt, you and Lori did a great presentation highlighting the passenger travel. Could you also comment on cargo traffic performing relative to passenger traffic, and what do you see implications for airports?
Sure. And so right away, the passenger carriers started putting a lot of cargo on their planes as much as they could, and some of them were running all cargo flights. But I have a slide I'll show everybody. This is prepared by the Airlines for America. It's somewhat similar to the slide Lori talked through before about passengers. This is the way cargo has recovered through the two most recent downturns in the economy. And it's interesting that after 9/11, cargo came back faster than passenger traffic. But after the recession, it came back slower. And it took about 2 years longer for it to recover to the same levels. So there's, I think, definitely a question as to whether or not, that is going to repeat itself, because as this pandemic becomes much more economically impactful to maybe mimic the recession, you may see cargo come back slower. But on the other side of the coin is, how many times a day do we get boxes delivered to our houses because we're not going out to stores? It's going to be really hard to see what happens there, but there will certainly be capacity in the bellies of airplanes in the near term.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the other thing that's occurring is part of the slowdown in the recession is the reduction in business-to-business shipping. So it's really, there's a bit of a change in the industry right now. The other aspect of this is we spend a lot of time talking about how challenging the cost structure is for the airlines and the airport given the crisis. Matt mentioned this, but what happens is in a rate recovery environment at airports, if the flying is reduced, the actual cost per turn by aircraft goes higher, or the landed weight the landed weight that the carriers pay is increased to make up for the shortfall in traffic. So the cargo carriers have been really shouldering a lot of the increased cost in the landing field because they have a much greater share of the market landing aircraft now than they had in the past when the passenger activity was so high. So their costs are increasing even more significantly. So it's going to be a challenge for everybody, both the cargo and the passenger side.
Thanks, Lori and Matt. Staying on cargo, Justin, are you looking into opportunity to increase cargo revenue?
Certainly we are. We have the 10th largest cargo capacity in the world, and we certainly see that as an opportunity for growth. One of the things that we're going to be doing in this next year is developing a strategy around what is the best way for us to set up cargo in this airport in order to be able to facilitate and grow our facilities so that we can handle more cargo. The demand is there, certainly was pre-COVID, and we think it will be even now for more capacity here. We just don't have the facilities. So we really need to focus on how we improve our cargo facilities here to promote more cargo. And that's definitely one of the priorities that we're looking at.
Justin, I have another question for you from Chad Kirkpatrick at Van Thornton. Are you experiencing any construction delays? If so, how are you managing schedule risk? And are you looking at vendor contract terms, social distancing guidelines for employees, or building design and permits and things like that within construction contracts?
Yes, to all of those. We have had impacts to construction projects because of COVID. There was a shortage of manpower available for many reasons, some that were out because of COVID or because they had exposure to people with COVID, others because in certain jobs you have to bus people to airside facilities, and people just weren't comfortable, so they weren't coming to work. So we had in some jobs a shortage of manpower that impacted us a little bit. We had, because of it was a global crisis, we had issues with materials. So we had some jobs that couldn't get the materials in a timely manner. Most of the projects have been able to work through it. We didn't have any work stoppages during this whole time, so all the jobs we've been on continued, and they're all working now to figure out how to make up for the time that's lost there. So we're having those discussions. But yes, most of the projects had some type of impact because of COVID-19. As far as going for the future, that's the biggest challenge we have at this airport, is being able to enable proper physical distancing in our terminals. Our terminals weren't built for people to have 6 feet in between them everywhere. Quite the opposite. The facilities are right-sized so that we can get the right number of people in there without building huge buildings and being able to take advantage of the space that we have. So as far as new buildings that we're going to be designing, yes, we have to think about this now and the way they're done, but we're also working with a lot of partners to understand how we can reorganize our existing facilities to better facilitate physical distancing. But physical distancing is going to be a huge challenge as passenger traffic comes back here. That's why it's so important for us to put in all these other types of protections, the temperature check pilot before people even walk in, all the cleaning, the facial coverings. Everything that we're doing is because we recognize that physical distancing is going to be difficult. So we have to build in all different other types of protections to keep the people safe and healthy when they're in our terminals.
Thank you, Justin. We're going to conclude our Q&A with one comment to especially thank the airlines and how helpful the airline staff have been to make sure people are being safe and socially distanced. So thank you to all our airline partners today. Well, this was a wonderful way to start our Wednesday. Again, I would like to thank our presenters, Matt Ross, Lori Peters, and Justin Erbacci for the time this morning. We know how busy you are, so we thank you for being with us here. Both the presentations that were done by AvAirPros and Lava will be made available for all of you on the call, so watch for that. Again, special thanks to our incredible sponsor who made the morning happen, AvAirPros, Lava, Parsons, Jacobs, and Burns Engineering. Lastly, to all of you, thank you for being with us this morning. If you are not a member of the LAX Coastal Chamber of Commerce, I will say you're missing out. So I encourage you and your company to consider getting involved. The Chamber has been a community member in the community active for over 16 years as a voice of the business in and around the airport community. Even during this pandemic, the Chamber provided critical touch points and resources to help get the businesses back on their feet. Truly appreciate the leadership of Christina Davis and all her staff at the Chamber. Again, I would encourage you to connect with Chad Mander, our Vice President, and to learn more about what's involved in being a member of the Chamber. So again, thank you all. Have a great Wednesday and stay safe and wear your face mask.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you. Very informative. Great job. Really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
Matt.
Bye-bye.
You guys, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.